Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. Picture this. It's Christmas night, 1467. There are no hymns, no church bells, only screams. You're standing knee-deep in frozen mud in the town of Baia, in what is now Romania, watching something that should be impossible. The King of Hungary is running for his life. Matthias Corvinus, the most powerful ruler in Central Europe, commander of the feared Black Army, isn't leading troops or rallying men. He's bleeding. 3 arrows are buried in his back. His guards are dragging him through the snow on a makeshift stretcher, panicked, slipping, terrified. The town around him is a furnace. Wooden houses collapse in sheets of flame. Narrow streets are clogged with corpses. Knights cut down so fast they never had time to buckle their armor. Horses burn in their stalls. The air stinks of smoke, blood, and betrayal. And the man hunting the king isn't an Ottoman warlord. He isn't a foreign invader. He's Matthias's own vassal, Stephen the Great, the ruler who deliberately set his own city on fire just to turn it into a death trap. History remembers Stephen as a saint, a defender of Christendom, a hero against the Ottomans. But the people who survived that Christmas night knew something else. Stephen wasn't just pious, he was ruthlessly intelligent. He understood a brutal truth. When you're a small fish surrounded by sharks, you don't fight clean, you destroy the water. Before we dive deeper into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the darker truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It still amazes me that we explore these moments together across continents and centuries. Matthias Corvinus marched into Moldavia, expecting submission, not annihilation. Weeks earlier, he had crossed the Carpathian Mountains with nearly 40,000 mercenaries, German infantry, Hungarian cavalry, veterans hardened by constant war. His goal was simple: crush Stephen, an upstart prince who dared refuse Hungarian dominance. The strategy was textbook medieval terror: burn the villages, strip the countryside bare, starve the peasants until the enemy is forced into open battle where heavy cavalry could grind them into the dirt. Stephen refused to play that game. He didn't offer Matthias a battle, he offered him a void. As the Hungarian army advanced, they found abandoned villages, empty storehouses, wells fouled wit, poison and corpses. Roads turned into traps, supplies vanished. Winter tightened its grip. And then on Christmas night, Stephen sprang the trap. Baia became an inferno, and the Black Army walked straight into it. Stephen had evacuated the population and stripped the land bare. Hunger began to gnaw at the discipline of Matthias's troops. By the time they reached the town of Baia, the cold was key, laying as many men as the arrows flying from the tree lines. Matthias garrisoned his freezing army inside the town, confident that the winter snow provided a shield. He assumed Stephen was retreating. He was wrong. Stephen was waiting. As darkness fell on December 14th, 12,000 Moldavians silently surrounded the town. They didn't bring siege engines, they brought torches. On Stephen's signal, the night expel did. They lit the wooden palisades from 3 different directions, leaving the 4th open, not as an escape route, but as a killing zone. The fire spread with terrifying speed. Hungarian soldiers, drunk on looted wine and sleep, woke up choking on smoke. They stumbled into the streets only to be hacked apart by Moldavian infantry waiting in the shadows. The narrow alleys of Baia negated the Hungarian advantage in numbers and cavalry. A knight on a horse is a tank in an open field. In a burning alley, he's just a man trapped in a metal oven. Stephen rode directly into the flames. Chronicles describe him cutting through the chaos, hunting for Matthias. He wasn't trying to rout the army, he was trying to decapitate the state. His archers spotted the king's royal guard and unleashed a volley. Matthias took 3 hits. His bodyguards barely managed to drag him out of the inferno, fleeing into the mountains, while their comrades burned behind them. The superpower of Eastern Europe had been broken in a single night by a prince with a fraction of the resources. But the aftermath reveals the true nature of Stephen's leadership. As the sun rose over the smouldering ruins of Baya, Stephen did not throw a victory feast. He looked at his own commanders, men who had hesitated, allowing the wounded King Matthias to escape the trap. Stephen didn't accept excuses. He lined up 20 of his highest-ranking noblemen, boyars who owned vast estates, and executed them in front of the troops. 40 others were impaled on the spot. He sent a message written in blood. Betrayal and incompetence were far more dangerous to him than any foreign army. Matthias Corvinus got the message. He signed a peace treaty and never attacked Moldavia again. The Hungarian threat was neutralized, but Stephen had no time to rest. While the West licked its wounds, the East was stirring. The Ottoman Empire, led by the man who conquered Constantinople, had been watching. They saw a dangerous new player on the board. To understand how, Stephen became this man, a ruler capable of burning his own towns and executing his own generals. We have to go back. We have to look at the blood that stained his hands long before he picked up a sword. We have to go back to a wedding feast turned massacre and 2 orphaned boys hiding in the shadows of Transylvania. To understand the fire at Baya, you have to understand the blood at Rusini. You have to go back 16 years to an autumn night in October 1451. Stephen was just a teenager then. He wasn't a king. He wasn't a general. He was simply the son of the ruling Prince Bogdan II. The setting was supposed to be joyful, a wedding feast in the village of Rusini. Wine was flowing, music was playing, and the guards had lowered their spears in the brutal politics of the Balkans. Letting your guard down was a death sentence. As the festivities reached their peak, the doors didn't open for a late guest. They burst open for an assassin. Petruaron, Stephen's own uncle, stormed the hall with a band of mercenaries. He didn't come for a negotiation. He came for the crown. Before the royal guards could even draw their swords, the hall turned into a slaughterhouse. Stephen watched as his father was cut down amidst the overturned tables and spilled wine. Bogdan, the Set, was beheaded right there on the banquet floor. In the chaos, the young Stephen managed to slip away into the night. He didn't just lose a father that evening. He lost his country, his inheritance, and his innocence. He became a fugitive in his own land, hunted by his uncle's men who wanted to snuff out the last legitimate heir. He fled south, crossing the mountains into Transylvania and then Wallachia. And it was here in the cold wilderness of exile that destiny played its most ironic card. Stephen found refuge with another noble orphan, a young man who carried a similar burden of trauma and rage. His name was Vlad Dracula. History often paints them as rivals, but in those early years they were blood brothers, bound by a shared nightmare. Both were sons of murdered fathers. Both had seen their thrones stolen by usurpers backed by foreign powers. Both were living on borrowed time, living in the shadow of the Hungarian and Ottoman empires. They learned the brutal curriculum of survival. They analyzed why their fathers died. Bogdan had trusted his family. He died for it. Vlad's father had trusted the boyars. He was buried alive. The lesson was etched into their minds. Trust no one. Strike first. Mercy is a luxury of the safe, and they were never safe. During these years of exile, the dynamic between them forged the future of Eastern Europe. Vlad, older and more experienced in the horrors of the Ottoman court, where he had been a hostage, was the volatile force, fire, and terror. Stephen was the ice, calculating, observant, patient. While Vlad dreamed of impaling his enemies to create a landscape of fear, Stephen began to understand that fear alone was not enough. You needed structure. You needed a fortress that couldn't be breached from the inside. By 1457, the waiting was over. Vlad had reclaimed the throne of Wallachia and become the ruler we now know as the Impaler. He didn't forget his cousin. He gave Saint. Even 6,000 experienced Wallachian soldiers and pointed him north towards Moldavia. It was time to settle the debt. Stephen marched back into his homeland, not as a boy but as a warlord. He met his uncle, the usurper Petruaron, on the battlefield of Dolt. This wasn't a skirmish, it was an execution. Stephen's forces shattered the usurper's army. although Aaron managed to flee into Poland, beginning a decades long manhunt that Stephen would obsessively pursue. The victory was decisive. At the age of 24, Stephen the Great was anointed Prince of Moldavia. The ceremony took place in a field under the open sky, surrounded by the soldiers who had bled for him. It was a coronation of iron, not gold. But as the crown was placed on his head, Stephen looked out at the faces of the Moldavian boyars, the nobility, who had bowed to his father, then bowed to his uncle, and were now bowing to him. He saw the same men who had stood by and watched his father die at that wedding feast. He knew their loyalty was as thin as the morning mist. He realized that defeating his uncle was the easy part. The real war was just beginning. It wasn't against the Hungarians or the Ottomans yet. It was against the enemy within. The boyars believed they could control this young prince, just as they had controlled his predecessors. They thought he was just another temporary ruler in the revolving door of Moldavian politics. They were wrong. They thought they had crowned a puppet. Instead, they had crowned a man who had spent 6 years planning exactly how to dismantle their power bone by bone. The orphan of the Balkans had come home, and he had brought a sword for everyone. Stephen sat on the throne of Moldavia, but he knew he was sitting on a powder keg. In the 15th century, a prince was often just a temporary manager, allowed to rule only as long as he kept the powerful noble families, the boyars, happy. If a prince tried to tax them too much or limit their influence, he usually ended up poisoned, stabbed, or exiled. Stephen's father had been murdered precisely because he didn't watch his back. Stephen had no intention of making the same mistake. His cousin Vlad had solved this problem in Wallachia with spectacular brutality. Vlad invited his treacherous nobles to a feast, asked them how many princes they had survived, and then impaled the lot of them while he finished his dinner. It was effective, but it was unstable. It created a climate of pure terror that eventually left Vlad isolated with no one left to run the country. Stephen chose a path that was arguably more dangerous, but infinitely more sustainable. He didn't just want to kill traitors, he wanted to restructure society itself. He launched a systematic purge, but he did it with the cold precision of a surgeon rather than the rage of a butcher. He started by seizing the estates of any boy who showed even a flicker of disloyalty. Executions were frequent, but they were always followed by a redistribution of assets. He took the land from the old entrenched families who felt entitled to rule, and he gave it to a new class of men. He called them the vitae or the braves. These were not high-born aristocrats. They were lesser nobles, free peasants, endy soldiers who had distinguished themselves in battle. Stephen offered them a simple deal. Fight for me, bleed for me, and I will give you land, status, and a voice. For the first time, a Moldavian peasant had a direct line of loyalty to the prince, bypassing the local lords entirely. This was a revolution. In the feudal system of Europe, armies were usually collections of private levies raised by local barons. If a baron didn't want to fight, his men didn't show up. Stephen broke this dependency. By creating the Vitaji, he built a standing army that answered only to him. When he called the banners, 40,000 men would answer, not because their lord forced them, but because their prince had given them a stake in the country. To secure this new order, Stephen turned his attention to stone and mow. He began a massive fortification project that would turn Moldavia into a prickly porcupine of defences. The crown jewel was the citadel of Suceava. He didn't just repair the old walls, he engineered a fortress designed to withstand the new god of war, gunpowder artillery. He thickened the walls, deepened the mows, and built sophisticated firing platforms. Sucha became the physical embodiment. His reign, unyielding, grim, and permanent. He stockpiled it with grain, weapons, and gold. It was a clear signal to both his internal enemies and his external neighbors. The days of weak, pliable Moldavian princes were over. However, this consolidation of power came at a price. The old boy family seethed in silence. They sent secret letters to Hungary, to Poland, and even to the Ottomans, for someone to remove this tyrant. But Stephen was always one step ahead. He created an extensive spy network that permeated every court in the region. He knew who was whispering against him before they even finished their sentence. By the early 1460s, Stephen had achieved what seemed impossible. He had pacified the internal chaos of his country. He had a loyal army, a full treasury, and a secure throne. But stability in the Balkans is a fleeting luxury. Just as he finished securing his own house, the neighborhood began to burn. South of the border in Wallachia, his cousin Vlad Dracula was picking a fight that he couldn't win. Vlad had stopped paying tribute to the Ottoman Sultan and had begun his famous campaign of terror against the Turks. The Ottoman response was inevitable and massive. Stephen watched the gathering storm with a calculating eye. He owed Vlad for the help in regaining his throne years ago. The code of honor dictated that he should ride south and stand shoulder to shoulder with his cousin against the Islamic invasion. But Stephen wasn't a knight in a romance novel. He was a practitioner of realpolitik. He looked at Vlad's reckless provocation of the Sultan, and he oaked at his own fragile, newly built state. He made a decision that still divides historians today. When the time came to choose between saving his friend and saving his country, Stephen didn't just hesitate. He drew his sword and he turned his gaze toward a prize that would shock the Christian world. History loves a good team-up. We want to believe that Stephen the Great and Vlad Dracula, the two champions of Christendom, stood back to back fighting off the Ottoman hordes. But history is not a Marvel movie. In 1462, the relationship between the cousins didn't end in a brotherhood of steel. It ended in blood and calculation. To understand why, we have to look at the difference in their methods. If Vlad Dracula was a butcher, wielding fear like a blunt cleaver to hack away at his enemies, Stephen was a surgeon. A butcher creates a mess to make a point. A surgeon cuts with precision to save the organism, even if it means amputating a limb, and in the summer of 1462, Stephen decided that his cousin Vlad was the limb that needed to be cut. The focal point of this drama was the fortress of Chilea, located at the mouth of the Danube River. Chilea wasn't just a castle, it was the lung of the entire region. Whoever controlled Chile controlled the trade routes between the Black Sea and Central Europe. For years, it had been garrisoned by Hungarians and Wallachians. Stephen knew that if he wanted Moldavia to survive, he needed that lung. He couldn't afford to let it fall into Ottoman hands, nor could he leave it with a volatile cousin who was provoking a war he couldn't win. In June 1462, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II led a massive army into Wallachia to crush Vlad once and for all. This was the moment for Christian unity. But while Vlad was launching his famous night attack to assassinate the Sultan, Stephen did something unthinkable. He marched his army to Chilea, not to help Vlad, but to take the fortress from him. It was a cold, calculated move. While Vlad was fighting for his life in the south, Stephen was besieging his garrisons in the north. He was effectively opening a second front against his own ally. During the siege, Stephen was shot in the ankle, a wound that would never fully heal and would plague him for the rest of his life, a constant physical reminder of his betrayal. But the surgeon knew what he was doing. He besieged the fortress for 8 days, bombarding it until the Hungarian and Wallachian defenders surrendered. He seized Chilea. From a sentimental perspective, it was a stab in the back. But from a strategic perspective, it was a master stroke. By taking Chilea, Stephen secured Moldavia's economy and closed the Danube Delta to the Ottoman navy. He knew Vlad was doomed. Vlad's terror tactics had alienated his own nobles, and he had no international support. Stephen calculated that it was better for Moldavia to hold the keys to the Danube than to let them sink with Vlad's ship, and think it did. Shortly after, Vlad was forced to flee to Hungary, where he was imprisoned not by the Turks, but by King Matthias Corvinus, the same man Stephen had humiliated at Bayer. In Vlad's place, the Ottomans installed his younger brother, Radu the Handsome. Radu was the anti-Vlad, soft, pliable, and completely loyal to the Sultan. While Ia had fallen, it was now essentially an Ottoman province. Stephen stood alone. The Bull of Moldavia was now the last independent power in the region. He had his fortress, he had his trade route, and he had his army. But he had lost his buffer zone. There was no longer a wild dragon in the south to distract the Ottomans. The path to Moldavia was now wide open. Stephen spent the next decade preparing. He knew the bill for Chile would eventually come due. He stopped paying the annual tribute to the Sultan, a direct challenge that echoed Vlad's earlier defiance. But unlike Vlad, Stephen didn't rely on spikes and terror. He relied on the Vitaji, his peasant army, and the network of fortresses he had painstakingly restored. In 1474, the summons arrived. Mehmed, the conqueror of Constantinople, the man who had humbled empires, was tired of this insolent Moldavian prince. He didn't just want tribute anymore, he wanted Moldavia. He sent an army of 120,000 men, arguably the most powerful military force on the planet at that time, north towards the Danube. The surgeon had cut out the butcher to save the patient. Now he would have to prove that he could survive the infection that followed. The storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived, and it was heading straight for a muddy plain near a town called Vaslui. By 1474, the patience of Mehmed II had run out. The Sultan was not a man accustomed to being told no. He was the Fatih, the conqueror, the man who had smashed the walls of Constantinople with cannon fire and turned Hagia Sophia into a mosque. Emperors and kings kissed his ring, yet up in the misty forests of the north, a minor prince was refusing to pay his rent. Stephen had stopped paying the annual tribute of 2,000 gold ducats. It wasn't about the money, the Ottoman treasury was overflowing, it was about submission. To Mehmed, Stephen's defiance was a dangerous spark that could ignite rebellions across the Balkans. The Sultan decided to stomp it out. He didn't come himself. Not yet. He sent his most trusted general, Sultan Pasha the eunuch. Sultan was given a force that defies modern comprehension for the medieval era, 120,000 men. To put that in perspective, the population of London at the time was barely 50,000. This wasn't an army, it was a migrating nation of soldiers, camp followers, artillery, and livestock. It included the elite janissaries, Christian children raised as fanatical Muslim warriors, and the terrifying Sipahi cavalry. Their orders were explicit: crush Stephen, install a puppet ruler, and turn Moldavia into a stepping stone for the invasion of Poland and Hungary. Against this tidal wave, Stephen could muster perhaps 40,000 men, and the majority of them were not professional soldiers. They were the rosier, free peasants armed with spears, axes, and bows. On paper, it was a suicide mission. 1 odds against the best-trained war machine on the planet, but Stephen knew something Sultan ignored: the calendar. The Ottomans invaded in late 1474. Winter was closing in. Stephen looked at the grey sky and the freezing mud, and he decided to weaponize the landscape itself. He issued air command that sent a shudder through his own people: leave nothing for the enemy. This was the scorched earth strategy taken to its absolute extreme. As the Ottoman column lumbered north, they found a ghost world. Villages were abandoned, granaries were empty, wells were filled with animal carcasses or poisoned. The Moldavians had taken their cattle and vanished into the deep forests and mountains. Imagine being an Ottoman soldier. You're marching hundreds of miles from home. The temperature is dropping below freezing. You're hungry, but there is no food to forage. You are thirsty, but the water kills you, and you are constantly watched. Stephen didn't engage them in open battle. Not yet. He used hit-and-run tactics. His light cavalry would burst out of the tree, fire a volley of arrow into the Ottoman flanks, and disappear before the heavy Sipes could mount their horses. They targeted the supply wagons. They picked off stragglers. They turned the march into a slow, bleeding ulcer. Suleyman Pasha pressed on, driven by arrogance and the Sultan's orders. He believed that if he could just force Stephen into a stand-up fight, superior numbers and firepower would win the day. He led his starving, freezing army deeper into the trap, aiming for the capital, Sushi. He didn't realize that Stephen was hurting him. The Moldavian prince had chosen the battlefield weeks in advance. He had selected a narrow, marshy valley near the town of Vaslui. It was a place where the Ottoman numbers would count for nothing, where the mud would swallow their cannons and where the fog would blind their commanders. By January 1475, the stage was set. The Ottoman army, exhausted and demoralized, stumbled into the misty valley. Waiting for them in the gloom was Stephen, his peasant army, and a plan so audacious it remains studied in militaries to this day. The surgeon was ready to operate. On the morning of January 10, 1475, the sun did not rise over the Ballard Valley. It was choked out by a fog so thick that a man couldn't see the tip of his own spear. Sulian Pasha, commanding the 120,000-strong Ottoman juggernaut, was confident. Despite the hunger and the cold, he believed his sheer numbers would crush the Moldavian resistance. He ordered his troops forward across the high bridge, funneling them into a narrow, marshy valley. He thought he was marching into a battlefield. In rear, he was marching into a kill-box. The ground beneath the valley was a deceptive horror. The winter thaw had turned the marshland into a soup of freezing mud. As the heavy Ottoman cavalry, the seppies, charged forward, their horses didn't gallop, they sank. The pride of the Sultan's army was immobilized, flailing in the muck, unable to maneuver, unable to charge. Then the silence of the fog was shattered. Stephen had positioned his artillery, cannons he had painstakingly acquired, on the surrounding hills. They fired blindly into the mist, but the target was so dense they couldn't miss. Cannonballs tore through the packed ranks of the Janissaries, but the cannon fire was just the opening note of Stephen's symphony. The real stroke of genius came from the forest. Stephen had ordered his music, Ians, buglers and drummers, to hide in the dense woods far to the side of the main battlefield. At his signal, they began to play. Thousands of bugles blasted the signal for a charge. Drums thundered through the trees to the Ottoman commanders. Disoriented by the fog and the chaos, it sounded like a massive fresh army was attacking their flank. Suliman Pasha panicked. He ordered his troops to turn and face this invisible threat. But there was no army in the woods. There was a phantom. As the Ottoman lines twisted in confusion, exposing their backs to the valley, Stephen unleashed the real blow. His heavy infantry and peasant soldiers, who had been waiting silently in the mist, charged. They didn't fight with the elegance of fences, they fought with the fury of men defending their homes. They wielded long axes and scythes, weapons designed to pull knights off horses and hack through armor. The result was a massacre. The Ottoman army, the conquerors of Constantinople, dissolved into a panicked mob. They trampled each other in the mud trying to escape. The bridge they had crossed became a bottleneck of death. Those who weren't cut down by the Moldavians drowned in the freezing marshes. By the time the fog lifted, 40,000 Ottoman soldiers lay dead. 4 Purs were killed. Over 100 standards were captured. It was the greatest defeat the Ottoman Empire had ever suffered at the hands of a Christian leader. Stephen the Great rode through the carnage, but he didn't gloat. He knew exactly what he had achieved, and more importantly, what he hadn't. He had won a battle, not the war, as his so. Eldiers celebrated, calling it a miracle. Stephen sent a letter to the Pope and the kings of Europe. It wasn't a victory lap, it was a desperate warning. "I have cut off the right hand of the pagans," he wrote, "but the other hand is coming." He knew, Mehmed said. He knew the Sultan would not accept this humiliation. Vaslui wasn't the end, it was just the provocation for something much, much worse. The company Nkira would not send a general next time. He would come himself and he would bring hell with him. Victory at Vaslui was a drug and Europe was high on it. The Pope hailed Stephen as the athlete of Christ. Royal courts from Venice to Budapest sent letters of congratulation. But letters don't stop cannonballs. While the West celebrated, Mehmed II was gathering a storm that made the previous invasio. N looked like a raiding party. In the summer of 1476, the Sultan did what he rarely deigned to do. He took personal command. He marched north with a massive army, but this time he brought an insurance policy. He coordinated with the Crimean Tatars to attack Moldavia from the east simultaneously. It was a strategic checkmate. Stephen was waiting in his prepared defenses. But when news arrived that the Tatars were burning villages in the east, his peasant army, the Rishi, begged to go home to save their families. Stephen, knowing that a soldier worrying about his burning home is useless, let them go. He was left with barely 10,000 professional soldiers to face the full wrath of the Ottoman Empire. He chose his ground at Rezboy, a plateau surrounded by dense forests. He couldn't win by force, so he planned to turn the forest into a weapon. As the Ottoman vanguard approached, Stephen set the woods on fire. Imagine fighting in an oven. The Janissaries advanced through smoke and falling timber, choking and blinded. For hours, the small Moldavian force held the line, fighting like demons in the burning undergrowth. But the sheer weight of numbers was undeniable. Mehmed sect, seeing his troops falter, threw his personal guard into the fray. The Ottoman wave broke over the Moldavian shield wall. Stephen's army wasn't just defeated, it was annihilated. The slaughter was so extensive that the battlefield was later named Valia Alba, the White Valley, because for years afterward the ground was carpeted with the sun-bleached bones of the dead. Stephen escaped, but he was a broken man. His army was G1. His country was overrun. The Sultan was marching on his capital. This is the moment where most kings would surrender or flee into exile. And here we encounter one of the most powerful legends in Romanian history. It is a story told in every classroom. And while details may blur between fact and folklore, the emotional truth defines the nation. The story goes that a wounded, exhausted Stephen owed to the citadel of Nemps, where his mother was staying. He knocked on the gate, desperate for refuge, desperate for comfort. The gate did not open. His mother appeared on the ramparts. She looked down at her son, the defeated king, the fugitive, and she refused to let him in. "I am the mother of a winner, not a coward," she is said to have cried. "Go back, gather what men you can, die for your company. Untry or come back victorious, but do not come in here to hide." Whether she actually said those words is less important than what Stephen did next. He didn't break. He turned his horse around. He rode into the mountains. He gathered the survivors. He rallied the peasants who had returned from fighting the Tatars. He turned into a ghost. Meanwhile, Mehmed was finding that conquering the land was different from conquering the people. He marched to the citadel of Suceava, expecting it to surrender. It fired cannons at him. He marched to Namp. The gates remained shut. His army, vast and hungry, began to die. The scorched earth tactics were working again. Plague broke out in the Ottoman camp. Mehmed II, the man who toppled Constantinople, found himself standing in a deserted, burnt-land Swati NG at flies, watching his invincible army dissolve from disease and starvation. He had won the battle at the White Valley, but he was losing the war against the Moldavian spirit. In August 1476, with his supply lines stretched to breaking and his men dying of dysentery, the Sultan ordered the retreat. He had burned the villages, but he hadn't broken the prince. Stephen emerged from the mountains, as a conqueror, but as a survivor. He walked through the White Valley, looked at the bones of his friends, and swore an oath he would rebuild, but as the Ottomans retreated, a new insidious threat appeared. It didn't come from the pagan south, it came from the Christian north. Poland, seeing Moldavia weak and bleeding, decided it was the perfect time to claim a piece of the pie. Stephen the Great was about to learn that in politics, neighbors are often more dangerous than enemies. By the 1490s, Stephen was an old man by medieval standards. He had spent 40 years in the saddle. His hair was grey. His face was lined with the stress of survival, and the wound on his leg from the siege of Chile had turned into a festering chronic agony. He had earned a rest. He had earned the gratitude of Europe. Instead, he got an invasion force from his allies. In 1497, King John Albert of Poland gathered a massive army. Officially, he declared a crusade against the Ottomans to retake the lost ports of the Black Sea. Stephen, initially cautious, prepared to assist. But as the Polish army crossed the border, they didn't march toward the Turks. They marched straight for Sushi, Stephen's capital. The mask H. Ad slipped. John Albert didn't want to fight the Sultan. He wanted to depose Stephen and replace him with his own younger brother, Sigismund. It was a naked power grab wrapped in the flag of a crusade. The shield of Christendom was being attacked from behind by the very people he was protecting. But John Albert made a fatal mistake. He assumed that the old lion had lost his teeth. He laid siege to Ucheva, pounding its walls for 3 weeks. But Stephen had spent decades turning that citadel into an impenetrable nut. The Polish cannons bounced off the reinforced walls. The Polish supply lines began to vanish, cut by Moldavian raiders. Realizing his crusade was turning into a disaster, John Albert negotiated a truce to retreat safely back to Poland. Stephen agreed on one condition. The Polish army must return the way they came, through the devastated, mud-choked roads they had already ruined, not through the fresh, untouched lands of the north. John Albert agreed. Then he broke his word. He marched his army into the rich wooded territory of the Kosmin Forest. Stephen was waiting. On October 2006, 1497, the Polish heavy cavalry, the pride of the aristocracy, entered the narrow ravines of the forest. The trees towered over them, creating a tunnel of gloom. Suddenly, the forest itself seemed to collapse. Stephen had ordered his men to cut the trunks of the massive beech trees almost all the way through, hiding the cuts with moss and leaves. As the Poles passed, the Moldavians pushed the trees over. Dominoes of timber crashed down onto the column. Horses were crushed. Knights were pinned. The formation was shattered before a single arrow was fired. Then the peasants attacked. It wasn't a battle. It was a riot. The heavy Polish armor, designed to deflect lances in an open field, was useless against trees and mud. The Moldavian peasants, the Razici, swarmed over the trapped knights, dragging them down, stripping them of their weapons. The aftermath of the Battle of the Kosmin Forest Company contains a detail so specific and so humiliating that it reveals Stephen's utter contempt for the aristocracy that had betrayed him. He captured thousands of prisoners, including many high-ranking Polish nobles. He didn't ransom them. He didn't execute them. He put them to work. Stephen forced the proud Polish knights to break their swords and turn them into plowshares. He then yoked the noblemen to the plows, treating them like oxen, and forced them to, till the fields they had tried to conquer, he made them plant acorns. Imagine the scene. Men who believed their blood was blue, who had never done a day of manual labor in their lives, whipped and driven across the mud by the very peasants they looked down upon. The beech forests of Bukovina that stand today are said to have grown from the acorn planted by the weeping nobility of Poland. This was Stephen's final lesson to the West. He was telling them that titles meant nothing to him. Crowns meant nothing. If you came to his land as a conqueror, you would leave as a servant. He had defeated the Hungarians. He had defeated the Ottomans. He had defeated the Poles. He had secured his borders against every major power in Eastern Europe. But, as the century turned and the year 1500 approached, Stephen faced an enemy he couldn't outmaneuver, couldn't ambush, and couldn't bribe. His own body was failing. The infection in his leg was spreading, and the shadow of death was finally creeping over the Iron Prince. If you travel to the Book of Region of Romania today, you will find something strange. Scattered among the green hills are churches, painted on the outside with vibrant fresco that have survived 5 centuries of snow, rain, and wind. The most famous is Veronets, known for a shade of blue so unique that art historians still call it Veronets blue. Its composition remains a mystery, but its purpose was clear. These weren't just places of worship. They were books for the illiterate. They were spiritual fortresses, and they were ID for with blood. Tradition holds that Stephen made a pact with God. For every victory on the battlefield, he would build a monastery. By the end of his life, he had fought 47 battles and built 44 churches. It is a staggering ratio. No other monarch in European history has left such a dense physical legacy of their gratitude, or perhaps their guilt. Stephen understood that armies die, walls crumble, and kingdoms fall. but culture, faith that can survive occupation. By planting these fortified monasteries across the land, he was creating a backup drive for the Moldavian identity. He knew the Ottomans might eventually conquer the land, but he wanted to ensure they could never conquer the soul of the people. But while his stone legacy was standing strong, his physical body was rotting. The wound he received in his ankle during the siege of Chilea in 1462, the campaign where he betrayed Vlad Dracula, had never healed. For 40 years it had been a dull ache. Now, in the early 1500s, it became a life-threatening crisis. The infection spread. Stephen, the man who could outride and outfight men half his age, was now confined to a litter or a carriage. He summoned the best doctors money could be. Physicians arrived from Venice, Genoa, and Nuremberg. Their methods, however, were medieval torture disguised as medicine. Records suggest they tried to burn the infection out with red-hot irons. They cauterized the wound, repeatedly trying to stop the gangrene. Imagine the iron discipline required to rule a country while enduring that level of agony. He received ambassadors while his leg, throbbed with fire. He dictated letters to the Pope while unable to stand. He planned the defense of his borders while bedridden. The pain must have been excruciating, a constant reminder of the violent path he had chosen. In these final years, the athlete of Christ began to prepare for the end. He retired more frequently to the Putna monastery, his first and greatest foundation. He wasn't hiding. He was assessing the future. He looked at the map of Europe and saw the reality his successors would face. Hungary was weakening. Poland was treacherous. The West was indifferent, and the Ottoman Empire was only getting stronger. The golden apple of Europe was ripening for the Sultan. Stephen realized that the era of total resistance was ending. He had held the gate closed for nearly half a century, buying Europe precious time. But he knew that after he was gone, the gate would burst open. His son, Bogdan, was a capable man, but he was not Stephen. No one was. So on his deathbed, the old strategist made one final shocking calculation. He called his advisors and his son to his side. He didn't tell them to fight to the last man. He didn't tell them to die for glory. He gave them advice that seemed to contradict his entire life's work. He told them to surrender. On July 2nd, 1504, the bells of Putnam Monastery began to toll. The sound rippled out across the valleys, carried from village to village until the entire Principality of Moldavia fell silent. The Iron Prince was dead. But before he took his last breath, Stephen left his son Bogdan III with instruction. That stunned the court. He advised his son to make peace with the Sultan. He advised him to accept Ottoman suzerainty. To the casual observer, this looks like failure. It looks like the old man finally broke. But look closer. This was Stephen's final masterstroke. He realized that Moldavia was too small to fight the Ottoman Empire forever. The goal was never to destroy the empire. The goal was to survive it. Stephen had fought for 47 years not to prevent contact with the Ottomans, but to dictate the terms of that contact. Because of the terror he had inflicted on the Turkish armies at Vaslui, at Vala Alba, and in countless skirmishes, the sultans respected him. They feared him. So when Moldavia finally submitted, it did not do so as a conquered province. It did not become a pashalic directal, ruled by a Turkish governor. It remained a sovereign principality. It kept its own laws, its own army, its own church, and its own princes. The Ottomans were forbidden from building mosques on Moldavian soil. They were forbidden from owning land. All the Sultan got was a bag of gold once a year and a promise of loyalty. Stephen had bought his country's autonomy with the blood of his enemies. He ensured that while the map might be painted Ottoman green, the heart of the country remained Moldavian red. This unique status, autonomy within the empire, is the reason why Romania exists today as a Latin island in a Slavic sea and why its culture was never erased during centuries of domination. So why does the world remember Vlad Dracula and not Stephen the Great? The answer lies in the nature of fire. Vlad is a global icon because he is a monster. He fits perfectly into our nightmares, a caricature of bloodlust that Bram Stoker could easily twist into a vampire. He is a great story because he is simple. Fear, blood, stakes. Stephen is harder to classify. He isn't a monster. He is a monarch. He burned towns. Yes, he executed traitors. Yes, he betrayed his cousin. Yes, but he also built church. He protected peasants. He negotiated treaties. He was a complex, contradictory human being who shouldered the weight of an entire civilization. He doesn't fit into a horror novel. He fits into the pantheon of the greatest statesmen in history. Vlad fought for revenge. Stephen fought for tomorrow. Today, if you visit the Putna monastery, you can stand before his tomb. It is made of white marble. Simple and elegant. There are no spikes, no grim legends of undead walkers. There is just an inscription for the most glorious prince. History has a way of filtering out the noise. The Ottoman Empire has fallen. The Kingdom of Poland is gone. The Kingdom of Hungary was partitioned. But Moldavia, the core of modern Romania, survived. It survived because one man 500 years ago was willing to be sage. Surgeon. He was willing to cut, burn and fight to keep the patient alive. Stephen the Great didn't just hold the line, he drew it, and he drew it in iron so deep that not even 5 centuries of wind and war could wash it away. So the next time you hear the name Dracula, remember the cousin who stood in the shadows. Remember the man who didn't just want to scare the darkness, but who built the light to hold it back.